Just a real quick unprepared video here. I'm working on this PET board for Sam M from Massachusetts, and I ended up using a couple of interesting troubleshooting techniques that I wanted to share. This one starts up with your typical random characters on screen, indicating that the CPU is not starting or running far enough to clear the screen. So I used the Tine-Mouth board to replace the CPU and set it to replace the RAM and the ROMs. See if I could get it to start up that way. And even with the RAM and the ROMs replaced, I still get nothing. So I set the Tine-Mouth board to run diagnostics. And with it running diagnostics, I noticed this snow or random pixels on the screen. This is typical on these old PETs because when the CPU writes directly to video RAM, it could be writing at any point in the raster and picking up random bits as the writes are made to video RAM. This was fixed on later versions of the PET. So the diagnostics program appears to be writing to video RAM. And that got me thinking, so I decided to try the Datasette test. Plug in a Datasette, and then listen to it when you turn it on. Hopefully you can still hear me. I've put the microphone on the Datasette so that you can hear sounds coming from it when I turn the PET on. So here's when I power it on. Listen. You can hear the motor spin for a second, right? It's because the default state for the motor is on until the PET boots up far enough to turn the motor off. If you press play, you hear the motor go back on. And then when you stop, the motor stops. If the motor starts and stops like that, that indicates that the CPU is running, because it's necessary for the CPU to be running to turn the motor off, and necessary for the CPU to be running for the motor to come back on again when you press play. The mechanical switch inside the Datasette doesn't actually turn the motor on. That just triggers the sense line on the Datasette port, and an interrupt tells the CPU to turn the motor on. So what we have here is actually a PET that is running. CPU started up, it's run the initialization code, and it's tried to clear the screen, and it's waiting for input, but there's nothing written to the screen. Looking at the schematic, there's a couple of signals of interest. This is the read-write signal from the CPU, and this is the select line that indicates that the CPU has selected the address for the video RAM. Video RAM is right here. This is the read-write line for the video RAM. CPU write line comes in here to this MUX and is selected by the select line. If this is not selected, then the video section is controlling the addresses here. When this line is asserted, the video section is disconnected and the CPU controls the address here. So I got out the logic probe. I'm connected to the power line on the Datasette port to power it. I'm going to check those signals. Actually, I want to make sure that the CPU is constantly trying to write to video RAM. So I put the Tine-Mouth board back in there running diagnostics. I see that static on the screen. It's going to make it hard to see, but we're going to take a look at pin 12 again. And it is continuously high, no change. Next I want to look at D2 on pin 6 and 7. So this is changing periodically. We're getting an occasional toggle at regular intervals. It's mostly high. Look at pin 7, which is the output. Take a look at pin 1. This is the signal that tells it to change. So this is changing at regular intervals as it writes to video RAM or selects the addresses. Pin 7, the output, is staying high. We're getting a signal here to change modes. The signal here on pin 6 is changing periodically, and the output on pin 7 is not changing at all. It chip at D2 is a 157 MUX, and I've got a spare handy here. And before I get the desoldering tool out and try to desolder it, I'm just going to try piggybacking a new chip on the top of the old one. And bingo, that's the diagnostics running. You can see it writing to video RAM, and this is actually showing the status of the first 0 page of RAM. Switching off diagnostic mode. So that's just a quick technique to use if you're not sure whether the CPU is crashed or whether there's a problem in the video section. If the datasette motor stops and then starts again when you press play, then you know the CPU is running and servicing interrupts. That's it for now. Thanks for watching.